Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 22nd, where we are continuing to talk about the textbook. So if you'll see in the notes below, I have our current notes here, and as I had indicated, I retire each week into the past class sessions folder, which you can find in the top part of our Moodle section. So you can reference what we've talked about thus far. Thus far, we've done 1 week. And what we are talking about now are the next 3 chapters in the textbook, being Understanding, which is chapter 4, Audience Analysis, Chapter 5, and Generating Ideas, Chapter 7, at least in the most recent edition of the text, which is what I am referencing in this class. I had indicated that you can use older editions of the text, but the chapter names might be different and the chapter numbers might be different as well. And all of this is to help prepare us for our upcoming speeches. The first being the autobiographical speech, which will be due on Thursday, the 31st. So I very deliberately put the textbook material up front so that could help you with formulating and ultimately delivering your speeches. And your first speech is a 5-minute autobiographical speech. And this is a speech that tells the audience something about you and your life. It could be a life overview, so you would be highlighting major elements of your life. It could be a specific hobby or interest. Keep in mind that the speech would be about you and not necessarily about an informative speech of the hobby or interest itself. Though that could be something that you do with your second speech, which is an informative speech. In fact, I've had students who have all 3 speeches, the autobiographical, the informative, and the persuasive, connect with one another. Not that that is a requirement. They could all be completely distinct from one another as well. You might perhaps want to focus on education if you're not exactly sure what to talk about with your first speech, because it's something that we all share. It could be your educational history, it could be perhaps your educational goals for the future, or it could be why you are enrolled in this particular class. And I'm asking you to record this speech, much like I record our class sessions, and upload it to Moodle by 11:59 p.m. of the due date. That will allow your peers to be able to view those speeches and respond to those speeches afterwards. And also to send me a speaking outline, and that's something we'll talk a little bit more about in greater depth next class. To send that to my email, which is how my grading program works best, at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. The speaking outline is just basically your guideline, your map, if you will, about how you are going to proceed with your speech. And of course, no one sees that speaking outline except for you. So you can certainly deviate from it, but just like following a map, if you decide to deviate from the map, there could be some consequences to that. So you need to be careful about that. Now, since this isn't necessarily a real event in the sense that it's a workshop, I'm asking to see your speaking outline just so that I can give you some feedback. And I will evaluate it informally on a checkmark system, whether it be plus for excellent or check plus for very good or check for satisfactory and so forth. And while we'll talk about the outlines, as I had indicated, a little bit more next class, to give you an idea what an outline would look like for me, you just need to look below this video because this is literally the speaking outline that I use. Here it is in paper format, and I always recommend that you have a paper version in the event that there's some sort of mechanical failure, so that you've at least got the information in front of you. But this is the outline that I use when I deliver my classes, and I just put my notes underneath the video. So if you'll remember last class, I left you with an attendance question about ways to reduce anxiety. And there's lots of different techniques, and the textbook talks about some, and you've probably had your own experience with some. A few that I wanted to highlight deep breathing. And studies have shown that during times of anxiety or danger, people tend to hold their breath. So you want to make sure that you're taking in nice deep breaths and getting oxygen in, which is when you need the oxygen the most, is when you have to, for instance, fight or flee, which was something we talked about in a women's self-defense class I took, that if we were ever attacked, we should yell out the word no. And it was secondary to draw attention to ourselves. The primary reason was to draw oxygen into our lungs when we would be very likely holding our breath, when we would need that oxygen. So in face-to-face classes, I actually do breathing exercises where I ask students to take in a deep breath and to hold it for 3 and then release it, and to do that 3 times. So getting the oxygen flowing can definitely help to reduce anxiety. I also suggest that you wear something that's comfortable. Certainly you want to wear something that's appropriate, but again, we live in a rather informal society, so you don't necessarily have to dress as if you were going to a job interview. But if you are uncomfortable in your clothing, you are probably going to be focusing more on the fact that you're uncomfortable rather than the actual speech. Making sure you're well fed, well hydrated, that you've had good sleep. All of those are excellent suggestions. Scent has oftentimes been linked with reducing anxiety. Lavender, for instance. Now, of course, if you don't care for the scent of lavender, that might not be the best scent for you. Music has also been shown to reduce anxiety, particularly classical music. But again, if you're not a classical music fan, perhaps another genre of music might help you. Some physical exercise before an activity that leads to some stress or anxiety, whether it's just walking around the block or perhaps just meditating. All of those things can be very helpful in terms of reducing anxiety. Sometimes people have nervous energy and they fidget, and I suggest you might want to hold something in your hand, a pen, for instance, a paper clip, for instance. Of course, you are speaking to a camera, so you get to decide how much of the image is visible. We certainly want to be able to see your face very clearly because we read so many facial expressions, which we will talk about next class as well. But today I wanted to talk about understanding, and this is basically your role as an audience member. The difference between hearing, which is where you process sound, which is what most people can do, as opposed to listening, which is paying attention and understanding. It's a very active kind of exercise as opposed to hearing, which can be very passive. Of course, you want to be an active listener, and studies have shown that most of us tend to be very poor listeners, and we also have very poor memories. It's one of the reasons why we suggest in academia that you take notes to try to keep you focused and also giving you something that you could reference back. There is a technique that you might have heard of before with note taking called RRA, where you review your notes. You relate the information in your notes to your own situation, and you try to anticipate what might be asked or what might be important. That's a very good technique to utilize. You don't want to just take notes and then not reference them. You want to look at them. There are lots of barriers to paying attention. And some language here, which is oftentimes what you find in an introductory 100 level course, the internal perceptual fields, which you might know of as daydreaming. And the thing is that we think much more quickly than someone can speak. So eventually our thoughts begin to drift and one thought leads to another. And before you know it, you've missed a good piece of information. There also is the external perceptual field, the environment, a loud noise, if it's too cold or too hot. Sometimes you can make accommodations for these things and sometimes you can't. Again, in terms of the internal perceptual field and daydreaming, note-taking can be very useful because it keeps you on task. And studies have shown that you're more likely to remember your notes if you handwrite them than if you type them. It has something to do with the actual muscle memory of creating the and forming the letters of the words. Now, some other things that can interfere with listening: trigger words. These are words that evoke strong emotional responses, more often than not negative responses. And then what that leads is to someone focusing on their internal perceptual field. And there's different kinds of listening. There's appreciative listening when you're listening for entertainment or enjoyment, let's say going to a concert, as opposed to discriminative listening, which is presentation, which is something that we will be doing in this class, not just the content, but how that content is delivered. There's empathic listening, emotionally supportive listening, which I suggest that all of us should do because we are all in the same situation of having to deliver a speech as well as listening to the speeches of others. Listening for comprehension, which is probably what you're doing now, and it's usually what you do in an academic situation. Listening for information. Critical listening includes, I suspect, all of those. It's questioning, it's analyzing, it's interpreting. And in fact, there's a speech rating handout in our syllabus and other documents section that I will be referencing that gives you the template of how I'm going to be evaluating your speeches, but it's also a good template for you to think about how you should be evaluating the speeches of your peers and also how you should be formulating your own speech. So I don't bother to use that template after the first speech. I just take notes of strengths and weaknesses. But that template basically is an overview of everything we have discussed and will be discussing in terms of delivering speeches. So chapter 5, which I had assigned, is audience analysis, that you really want to pay attention to who your audience is. This relates to, in part, what we talked a little bit about last class about culture. And we talked about culture as in its broadest sense, any group membership. And you can assume that you're going to have many different cultural groups in your audience. And culture, knowing the cultural group that someone is in, and oftentimes they are in multiple groups at the same time, has a certain level of predictive element that you can perhaps anticipate some behaviors, which are actions. That even includes something like a conversational style. So it's been shown that in some cultures, like Western cultures, they tend to be much more direct, as in the United States. Other cultures, such as Asian cultures, much less direct, much more indirect. And it's just an attitude. It's not that it's necessarily better or worse. It's just a stylistic preference for that particular culture. Attitudes or feelings. Oftentimes they're changeable, sometimes they're not. Beliefs, things that are true or false. Values encompass all of the above, and they can be highly, highly resistant to change. Something for us to think about when we are delivering something like the persuasive speech, which will be our last speech. And as you know, multicultural, many cultures, leads to the reality of what we are going to be experiencing with audience members. In fact, this is a whole discipline that's called demographics, and it's studying observable characteristics of individuals and which groups to which they belong. It could be a large group like age or gender or ethnic background. It could be more specialized like political affiliation or religion. It could be based on a hobby or an interest. And what oftentimes happens is that there is an attempt to segment the audience. It's known as audience segmentation, to divide the audience into its demographic groups so that you can anticipate perhaps some of the topics that might be of interest to those groups and what might be the best way to present those topics. But of course, if you're doing that, you're doing some kind of psychological profiling about a person's beliefs, their attitudes, their values, and you have to always remember that we are all individuals, so you want to avoid stereotypes. So these are overgeneralizations about an individual because we have individual variants. Now, the chapter also talks about how to deal with hostile audiences. I doubt you would ever be in a position where you're speaking to a hostile audience. Usually that's something that's done very deliberately, let's say in a political forum when you're speaking to the audience members from an opposing political affiliation. But you might be speaking to a skeptical audience. And some suggestions, I don't have a magic bullet for you, but some suggestions: establish goodwill, that there's good intention here. Areas of agreement. So rather than focusing on the places where you disagree, try to focus on the areas where you agree. Establish credibility, that you have some authority and understanding of the topic. Use credible outside sources. Outside sources help to give you credibility, and it's one of the reasons why you will be required to use outside resources in the third speech, which is the persuasive speech, where you might have a skeptical audience. You want to always be professional, or as professional as possible, particularly in today's digital world. We expect a certain level of professionalism. Use humor. Humor can be a great unifier. Now, humor can also be culturally based as well, so you need to be cautious to make sure that you're not using humor in a way that's considered to be offensive. Be multi-sided. So try to show lots of differing perspectives. Of course, the focus is going to be on your own, but a lot of times what happens with the opposing side is that they just want to be acknowledged. They don't even necessarily want buy-in, they just want acknowledgement that they exist. And try to establish some ground rules or principles for judgment. And again, I can't necessarily guarantee that these things will work, but they certainly are helpful. This leads us to the last chapter, chapter 7, in generating ideas, which is where you are now, and that you're trying to think about what will you discuss for your first speech. I've given you the topic, which is the broad idea, and autobiographical speech. But you need to select and narrow it. What specifically about your biography do you want to focus on? It could be as simple as talking about a time period. And in fact, next class, I'm going to show you some sample autobiographical speeches as well from students like yourselves, in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you would be highlighted in a class. These are just speeches that have been uploaded onto YouTube that are available for public access if they don't have any kind of privacy settings on them. So I thought it would be a good experience for us to see some of those speeches. We'll begin with the autobiographical speech and watching some examples of that, because that's the speech that we're preparing for. But we'll do the same with the informative, and we'll do the same with the persuasive. And you need to determine the purpose. And in your mind, that might be very obvious, that the purpose is obviously to fulfill the requirement so that you can earn a good grade, so that you can graduate, continue on with your plans. But specifically, the purpose for this first speech, in my eyes, is twofold. The first is to offer you an opportunity to practice the skills that we've been talking about in the textbook chapters. And secondly, to give us an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better. After the autobiographical speech, even in an online class, we should get a greater sense of who our classmates are. And you need to analyze the audience and the occasion. And the audience, in some ways, there's less to analyze in this particular situation, because you know that your audience is made up of GCC students. So that already tells you something about age and educational level. You would obviously be speaking very differently if you were speaking to a group of children than if you were speaking to a group of adults. So you need to accommodate who is in your audience and what would be the best method of reaching them, and the occasion. And I always tell a story, and this is actually a true anecdote. Sometimes those are much better than anything you can find in a textbook, about a student who really didn't think about the occasion. It didn't happen to me, it happened to one of my colleagues at another institution that shall remain nameless. And it was a public speaking class, and the speech was a very philosophical speech about being true to oneself. And the student was talking to the class and the teacher about being true to oneself. And as the speech progressed, the student began removing pieces of clothing. And when it looked like the student was going to actually disrobe, the teacher stopped the speech and asked the student what the student was doing. And the student responded by saying that the best way to be true to himself was to show his true self to the audience. So he was ultimately planning on disrobing in front of the audience. And well, the teacher stopped that. And might I suggest that this student had not considered the occasion, that it would be incredibly inappropriate to disrobe in an academic setting. So if you learn nothing else, please don't duplicate the mistake that this student made. Gathering material. Sometimes you need to find information for delivering your speech, and sometimes you already know the information. I deliberately assigned an autobiographical speech as your first speech because you probably already know everything that you would need in order to give an autobiographical speech. That doesn't preclude you, for instance, from interviewing family and friends or perhaps looking up some genealogical research, but you're not required to. The idea is you already have the knowledge. When we get to the informative speech, you may or may not already have the knowledge of what it is you're going to be talking about, which is why we will be talking about at that point, how do you gather outside resources. But you won't be required to use outside resources until the third speech, the third being the persuasive speech, which again, using outside resources helps credibility. And we'll talk about some of the effective ways of going about doing that in an oral situation, because you're probably more accustomed to doing that in a written situation. Practice. And I can't in any way emphasize the incredible importance or under emphasize the incredible importance of practice. So much so that if you wanted to, you could practice with me individually before you actually upload your speech. And as we continue to talk about the speeches, the idea is that you are recording yourself in one take. This is not a question of editing for a perfect speech. This is a question of what you could do in one sitting, much like I do during classes as well. There's a graphic actually on page 104 if you're using the most recent edition of the text. It looks like a staircase, and that graphic could be very useful for you in terms of thinking about the process of selecting and narrowing the topic, determining the purpose, analyzing the audience and occasion, gathering material, making a speaking outline, practicing out loud, delivering the speech, and thinking about all of that in the context of what we are going to be discussing next class. Organizing and outlining, because an outline is going to be required for the speech, and we'll talk about that. Introductions, conclusions, and transitions. The introduction and the conclusion are particularly important. There's something called the primary recency effect, where people tend to remember best what they hear and see first and what they hear and see last. So the introduction, the conclusion is particularly important. The first and last impression, if you will. And also the use of language, which is chapter 10 in the most recent edition of the book. Obviously, your language won't be as precise as if you were writing a paper, but you want to be conversational so that you're not reading or it's not memorized. It's as if you are having a heightened conversation with someone, I believe is the language that's used. In the Toastmasters video that I had asked you to watch last week, which also gives you a good overview of many of the points that we're going to be talking about. So, as I had indicated on the syllabus, there happens to be a speech rating sheet, and the speech rating sheet talks about the content of the speech, which is something that we'll be talking about next class, as well as the delivery of the speech, which is also something that we'll be talking about next class. So things like the introduction, and do you find a way to get your audience's attention, which could be as simple as just greeting your audience. And then do you transition into a preview statement or a thesis, which is your main point. And then the body, and sometimes this is called the discussion section. Is there a clear pattern? So do the connections make sense? Do you develop your points efficiently and effectively within the time limit that you've got, which is approximately 5 minutes? Your voice mannerisms. Are you using ums or ahs or other filler words where you should just be quiet or taking a deep breath? And well-chosen words. Again, you don't have to have the precision that you would have when you're writing, but you definitely want to avoid being so vague that the audience can't follow what it is that you are discussing. And then your conclusion, which could be just a summary or a restatement of what you've said before, but you're going to have to cue in your audience in one way or another to let them know that you're done speaking. It could be as simple as saying thank you. And in terms of delivery, as we'll also talk about, things like eye contact. And in Western cultures, much like in the United States, eye contact is considered to be respectful. In other cultures, for instance, Asian cultures again, eye contact can be considered disrespectful. So, again, you want to make sure who is your audience and what the cultural and demographic expectations are. Body movement, and again, you don't want to be on either end of the extreme, too stiff or too fidgety. And because you're recording yourself, you want to make some decisions about what to record. Do you want full body, partial body? I'm doing partial body, but you definitely want to make sure that your face is easily visible. Your vocal quality, so you don't want to speak in a monotone, and you want to make sure that you are being clear. And your articulation, how again clear and well formulated your words are. And your enthusiasm, you should appear to be enthusiastic even if you aren't enthusiastic. Because if you're not enthusiastic, if you're speaking in a monotone, if your volume is too low, if you're mumbling, all of that is going to negatively influence your audience. But as I said, we'll talk about these elements a little bit more, as well as talking about some student speeches that you can view and critique in terms of strengths and weaknesses for their autobiographical speech. But what's left for us today is our discussion forum question. And that will be due on Thursday because you've got 48 hours. But certainly, if you need additional time, please let me know. So Thursday the 24th, but I'll be happy to give you an extension if you need it. What do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering this first speech, and why? What do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. And believe it or not, basically, we would have talked about most of the major elements of the textbook, which after that class leads us to the transition of taking some quizzes and ultimately delivering speeches. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.